I think of all the people that use drugs, maybe 10% of them become drug addicts, probably less. We don't know why. What's the difference between people that can sort of responsibly use drugs, even illegal, really powerful drugs, and continue to live a life, maintain a family, maintain a career, and those that can't? We don't know. It's a really big area of research right now. It's one of the things that the National Institutes of Health is most interested in. What are the individual differences that underlie this predisposition to uncontrolled drug use and addiction? My name is Bill Fantegrossi. I'm an associate professor of pharmacology and toxicology. People have all kinds of career paths to get here. Mine, I definitely would not go back to my childhood and say that ever since I was little, I was interested in this kind of thing. That was not the case. What was a little bit different maybe for me was that I had a decent amount of alcoholism in the family, and that, affected me personally. And so about the time that kids started experimenting with that was when I discovered straight edge growing up around Boston, and there was a huge scene there in the 80s.
Music lovers are taking the old adage sex, drugs, and rock and roll and giving it an edge. This movement isn't new. It actually began about 30 years ago.
But it is growing in popularity right now. It's called straight edge. It goes against every stereotype of the hardcore punk music scene.
Let one of these kids babysit your children. You'd probably be psyched if your daughter brought one home. They are straight edge, a shorthand phrase to describe a series of tough life choices made by the people who listen to and create this kind of music. They refuse to drink, refuse to smoke, and they don't do drugs. Most refrain from promiscuous sex. A lot are even vegetarians.
And, on Fridays and Saturdays when other kids would be out partying, we would be going to hardcore matinees in Harvard Square and watching 6 or 7 straight edge bands in a row and then going and skateboarding. So it kind of became part of my identity that was an important thing for me.
Have you ever ingested any sort of mind-altering substance, including alcohol?
So I got an endoscopy the other day, and they gave me some. But I have not drank alcohol before. I haven't used any recreational drugs in my life. Yeah. Yep. So I'm a cheap date. My liver is virginal and would probably not be able to handle much of anything. Yep.
Talk about your the history of human interest in altered states. So we know from the archaeological record that some of the earliest drinking vessels, 10,000 years ago, had traces of beer, shamanic stuff, evidence of using of hallucinogens. Even before there was such a thing as civilization, before we were even living in groups.
Yeah, and I think in addition to sort of thinking about that with ancient humans, you can even go to animals at around the same time. So, there are instances of elephants that eat fermented fruit and go into these sort of drunken rampages, and it's a problem in some areas when these things come rolling through a village, knocking over huts.
In 1972, a group of elephants in India's Meghalaya state stumbled upon barrels of locally brewed rice beer. After consuming large amounts, the elephants became highly aggressive, rampaging through villages. One particularly enraged elephant chased a group of people up a tree and refused to leave until it eventually collapsed from intoxication.
In northern latitudes, there are reindeer that will come out and eat urine from humans that are intoxicated, and they can get enough unmetabolized ethanol out of the frozen urine that they get drunk.
So is that a behavior that's learned within the deer population?
I reckon it's got to be, right? I mean, it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that would happen normal. One of the things that has always, as long as I've been doing behavioral pharmacology and psychopharmacology, one of the studies that really sort of blew my hair back when I read about it was a study that was done with rhesus monkeys. And so there was a classic study that had nothing to do with drugs, where they would take chimpanzees and put them into sensory deprivation, so total darkness, white noise, and they would then introduce a key that the chimps could press, and they had to press it many, many times. And when they did, it would open a little window and they could look out into the laboratory. So basically you had animals responding to just have some kind of sensory stimulation. And there was sort of a version of that where they took rhesus monkeys and they put them into sensory deprivation and they trained them to emit a behavior in order to do the same thing, but the sensory stimulation in this case was DMT. So the monkeys were actually trained to smoke cigarettes made out of lettuce. And that was the behavior they had to do. They had to take a couple puffs of it in order to get water, and they were water deprived. So they're thirsty, you take a couple puffs of lettuce, you get to drink a little bit of water. And when you do that, if you put DMT in the lettuce, they will take a whole bunch of DMT. And they sort of interpreted this in the same way that the chimps will work to open a window to be able to see what's going on in the lab. These animals have nothing else going on, and they will work to open up a psychic window, is what they called it, and have some kind of sensory stimulation.
Without you removed the water deprivation.
Yes, and so, you know, if you have animals that aren't sensory deprived and you give them the opportunity to self-administer DMT or smoke DMT, they don't want anything to do with it. It's only when you put them into this kind of circumstance that comes up. And so, you know, that to me is what really defines kind of the essence of behavioral pharmacology and really shapes what I do in terms of drugs of abuse, is understanding that the contingencies that surround an organism are going to determine whether or not a drug is going to be an effective reinforcer or not. I mean, here's a drug that by most accounts has no reinforcing effects whatsoever in animals, but when you dial it in just right, these animals will work.
In the absence of no stimulation.
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, you can extrapolate that to humans probably and explain a decent amount of drug abuse.
I was gonna ask a B question, I guess you sort of answered it, but I ask it. So, why do some of us like to get high?
Yeah, so that's the important question, right? I mean, I think it's probably the case that everybody that gets high would like getting high if the circumstances were correct. And, you know, I think that that's a pretty, it sounds stupid to say that out loud, but you can kind of imagine a situation where a bunch of people get together and go to Burning Man or something, and they bring psilocybin and they take it together, and they're out in the desert in this environment where there's music and there's lights and there's all this stuff that kind of enhances that situation, and you have a very positive experience. But then you can probably imagine an analogous situation where somebody's at a bar and someone puts LSD in their drink and they take it unknowing, right? You're almost guaranteed a bad trip in that circumstance. And, you know, hallucinogens are a class of drugs where it's pretty easy to make that claim, but I don't think that's the only class. And I think you could say that about just about any drug.
Oh, yeah. If you were never had alcohol, didn't know what it was, and you drank it and didn't know, it'd be a very unpleasant.
Sure. And, you know, oral administration of drugs is difficult. And, you know, we do this kind of stuff with animals sometimes. And part of the problem is that you can tell a human, this tastes bad, but if you drink enough of it, you'll feel good. You can't do that with an animal. So it's hard to get them over the hump. I mean, you have this immediate bad taste and then a delayed pharmacological effect that only comes on if they drink enough of it, and most of them never do. But, you know, I mean, people that are in the hospital for a surgical procedure or something, they get a bunch of IV opioids. None of them come out and start shooting heroin, trying to chase that feeling, right? So the setting sort of surrounding your drug administration almost entirely dictates whether it's going to be sort of an enjoyable experience or if it's just going to be kind of a weird thing that you go through in order to come out the other end, like in a hospital situation or something like that. So, you know, the idea of why do people use drugs, I think, is kind of an obvious answer. They do it because they like it. The important question is, why do some people like it so much, you know, that they do it once and that's it. They're hooked forever.
Is it possibly symptomatic of an underlying depression or anxiety that just, so if you're a happy person and you take some Vicodin, you just say, oh, that made me feel groggy and weird. But if you're somewhat depressed and you chew a couple Vicodin, you do get a little bit of a mood boost and you do feel better.
Yeah, you know, for sure. The idea of comorbidity of sort of psychiatric conditions and drug abuse is a huge area of research. You know, people who are psychologically healthy certainly use drugs and in a recreational setting, but it's kind of rare for them to be what you would call an addict, right? You know, in the same way that I think it's almost impossible to be a drug addict and be rich, right? I mean, we could name movie stars who
be rich and then become a drug addict.
Well, but even still, right? I mean, what happens to them? They use a bunch of drugs, they get caught.
Or they die.
Or they die, right? The death is a problem, but prior to that, you know, you get caught and it's in the news. They don't go to jail, though. They go to treatment, and then they come out of treatment and they go back to their mansion and they film another Iron Man movie, not to single out anybody in particular, but they make a couple more $1 million, and now you're enabled to go back to whatever you want to do again. And that's a totally different thing than what happens to somebody that doesn't have those kinds of resources that gets caught with drugs. They wind up in prison. They may get treatment during that time, they may not, but either way, when they come back out of it, they are no less likely to return to drugs than the rich person. And when they get caught, they repeat the same process. So, you know, the whole sort of definition of drug addiction that we've kind of settled in on as scientists from the National Institute on Drug Abuse is that it's this chronic relapsing brain disorder that affects your life in negative ways. So it has to impact your family life. It has to impact your career. You know, it has to have these negative connotations. Continued drug use despite these, you know, really major social consequences. You can mitigate those social consequences quite a bit if you've got enough money.
Let's talk about your academic focus, your research, and why you think it's important and what's interesting stuff you're doing now.
Sure. So I guess, you know, to the extent that I have a specialty in anything, I tend to study what we call emerging drugs of abuse. So these are drugs that in the last decade or so have really exploded in terms of their availability and just the sheer number of them that we have. So, you know what, one of the standard slides that I use all the time when I give these sorts of talks to students and people in the community, I have two pictures next to each other, and one of them are two sketchy looking people standing on a street corner. There's a lot of graffiti on the corner, it's dirty and trashy, and one of them looks like he's passing something to the other person. And then the one next to it is this woman in a bathrobe, and she's lying on her belly with a laptop, and she's got candles lit. And I say, okay, so which of these people is buying drugs? And, you know, the answer is it could be either of them, right? I mean, at this point, you can go online from the safety of your own house. You can go to a website that's got SSL encryption. You can put your credit card number in there and feel totally secure. And in 5 to 7 days, you'll have a package delivered to your house by a mailman or a UPS guy, not a drug dealer, right? Not a sketchy person that you don't want to know where you live. You know, some of these websites will even advertise on there that if your package is confiscated by customs, you'll get a notice from customs saying this package came and we confiscated it. If you scan that in and email it to the company, they'll try again and just send it again because the profit margin is so huge. There's no reason for you to ever not get your drugs. When you do get your drugs, the customs notices are funny to read. So if you ordered a bunch of pills, it will say something like decorative beating kit on the customs declaration. So when it rattles, it doesn't raise any eyebrows. You know, they're pretty advanced. So, you know, people can order opioids, they can order cannabinoids, they can order psychostimulants, they can order hallucinogens just through the mail. A lot of these drugs will be things that are not outright illegal in the United States at the time that they're available. They'll be similar in terms of their chemical structure to other drugs that are. And so because of that, you kind of have to go to court and get experts to argue with each other to convince a judge that this compound that looks exactly like psilocybin except for this methyl group over here should be treated the same as psilocybin. And that's a high-level chemistry and pharmacology argument to have in front of people that don't necessarily have that kind of educational background. And it winds up just sort of sounding like two people shouting nonsense at each other, and somebody has to make a decision about it. So, you know, in addition to these drugs being easily available and being arguably legal, they also typically don't show up in drug screens. So you can have people in the military or law enforcement or people that are on parole or anybody that's subject to sort of random drug tests that want to continue to use drugs. They can take these drugs, and when they're forced to go pee in a cup, when we look for THC or amphetamine or morphine, we won't find that. You can't find what you're not looking for. and as the sort of chemical structures that can bind to the brain targets that are important for drugs of abuse. As we learn more about what those targets will tolerate, we can make completely different structures that are even less likely to ever show up in these tests until we find them and sort of recalibrate the tests to look for them. And that's where we are with a lot of these drugs now. So the things that are in bath salts, the synthetic cathinones, the things that are in K2 spice, the synthetic cannabinoids, by the time we get the tests set up to detect what's being sold, it's not being sold anymore, and there's a new generation that doesn't show up in our tests.
How dangerous are these drugs? Is that why you feel it's important to be researching them?
One thing that's really interesting is that question itself, right? How dangerous are they? And so, we heard earlier this summer about all the people in Brooklyn that were kind of wandering around in a zombie daze on some K2 spice product.
They smoking it. And they ODing on it.
Police say they are the likely victims of an especially potent or bad batch of the synthetic drug K2.
It's pretty bad. All they do is smoke and pass out.
Investigators trying to track where the drugs came from were inside Big Boy Deli, which was shut down because police say they failed a business inspection. Some men inside were arrested for allegedly selling untaxed cigarettes. This is very similar to what happened in mid-July of 2016, with 33 overdose cases in a single night around the same intersection. Residents, city council members, and other politicians said Sunday they want stepped-up police patrols in Bushwick and Bedford-Stuyvesant.
We've heard over the last couple of years about pretty bizarre attacks from people using synthetic cathinones. Just recently there was another one in Florida of a kid that all of a sudden got really angry at dinner with his family, decided to walk home. He attacked some people in their garage, murdered the husband and the wife, and when the police found him, he was eating the face of the dead husband.
This is a naked man. He was shot dead on Saturday by police because he was gnawing off another man's face.
This actually happened, and nobody knows why yet. So every time these things happen, they'll say, and we think the guy was taking bath salts. By the time you get the forensics later on, we don't detect anything, or we just didn't detect anything that we know to look for yet.
And so, we know the media looks for sensational stories.
Oh yeah, of course. And so, that first case of the guy eating the guy's face in Miami, the only thing they found in his system was THC. That's the only drug that was found in that guy. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't other things that at the time they tested we couldn't detect yet. And I don't know how much samples are still kicking around, if they could be retested now and maybe get a better picture of what was going on. But what I tell students all the time, and this sort of goes back to being a behavioral pharmacologist and working with laboratory animals and things like that, is that drugs don't take an organism and make them do something that they don't normally do. They can turn up the volume on a behavior that's already there. They can make you do it faster. They can make you do it for a longer time. They can make you do it more often. But there's no drug in the world that we could give a dog to make it meow like a cat or fly like a bird, right? That just doesn't happen. So I always tell the students that that guy had been thinking about eating somebody's face for probably years. He was probably really unstable mentally, and it just took something to push him over the edge. If it turned out that it was drugs, okay, maybe it was drugs. Maybe it was just a bad day. Maybe it was somebody almost hitting him with their car and giving him the finger instead of apologizing.
People come home from work and kill their wife.
Exactly, that kind of thing happens all the time. It's no crazier than when you hear about a professional athlete that snorts cocaine and has an aneurysm or something like that. That aneurysm was there. All it took was some cardiovascular stress, which might have been an overtime game. You know what I mean? If it didn't blow when he snorted a line, it could have blown in the playoffs when he was playing his heart out. And so, drugs get the blame. And I'm not even saying that's not deserved. I mean, the drugs can definitely kill people. It happens all the time. But with some of these things, the drug is not different than any other kind of stress, which might have been the precipitating event.
These are very important things to study, but they're also very sensationalistic by their nature and sensationalized for monetary gain by the media, but also for political gain by politicians. How difficult does that make your job, and how can an average person unravel, should I be scared of this, or do you even have an answer?
So the media are tricky. We kind of live in fear of getting asked to talk to the news. Arkansas is a tiny state. We're the only medical school in the state. We're the only pharmacology department. Within our pharmacology department, there's only a handful of us that even work with drugs of abuse. So anytime there's a drug story in the state of Arkansas, somebody's going to call UAMS. The press people are going to call our department. Our department chair is going to send it to one of us. And they're going to come and talk to us for an hour, and we're going to get 10 seconds of soundbite used on the news. I was asked a while back about an ecstasy bust here, and literally all they used was me looking like an idiot when they asked, what does ecstasy do? And I was talking about it, and one of the things I said was that it makes sensations feel better, and I kind of did corny, rubbed on my arm and said something like that. And it was on the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, and for the next 6 months, everybody I saw at work was going, hey, Dr. Fantegrossi, we have some ecstasy, rub your arm. And, it's annoying, right? So, we don't necessarily like doing that. But one thing that I do like doing is kind of working with state legislature, working with the police department, and even working with law. So, we get asked sometimes to do expert testimony or to contribute a scientific evaluation of certain data that is going to be used for a criminal case. So sometimes this will be in the capacity of new drugs that have appeared. People have been selling them at a local head shop. The police will come in and raid the place. They'll confiscate everything, and they'll say, here are the compounds that we found in some of these products. They're not actually illegal. Are they analogs of drugs that are already regulated? And so we can kind of take a look at their chemical structure. We can take a look at their known pharmacology and say yes or no. In the realm of commercial products sometimes as well. So some of these pre-workout drinks and bodybuilding supplements, some of those wind up with some compounds in there that aren't a hell of a lot different from amphetamine, for example. There's even people that argue that the companies that make these do that on purpose, because how do you distinguish yourself from what's already on the shelf, right? You put in something that has a huge kick until people are talking about this is the thing. Then once you've established a base, you can quietly sort of get rid of that compound, and hopefully that happens before the FDA ever finds out about it. Or even things that are testosterone analogs or anabolic steroids that can be in there early on and then quietly sort of moved away. So we can kind of contribute in that way. And I kind of enjoy doing that sort of thing. I'll write a declaration where I just evaluate what's known and what isn't known. And it's not that I'm writing it for one side or the other. It's just written and it's given, and both sides can sort of use that to make their case. I think that's kind of a neat position to be in. I think, if I don't do that, maybe nobody else will, or maybe somebody else will, but there's somebody that has their own kind of agenda and may not be objective about it. So, I kind of like doing that kind of thing.
Is there of all the drugs you've studied, does one seem to, of course, we lived through the crack cocaine hysteria. I mean, are there drugs that are more personally, physically destructive, or that you feel are more destructive to social structures, or because I know so much about the criminal side of it, I think that cocaine is so destructive because it's so expensive.
Yes.
And that's really what causes it to be so destructive.
So, whenever I talk to students about it, I always bring up the fact that when you talk about drug effects and even toxicity, you've got to consider two separate kinds. You've got your sort of acute toxicity, which could happen the very first time you take it, right? So there are certainly drugs that can kill you the first time you take them. Among the opioids, for example, we've seen this huge epidemic of opioid overdose on the East Coast. One thing that keeps coming up is that it keeps being ascribed to fentanyl. Very recently in the last couple of years, a drug that has emerged on sort of the gray market that you can buy through the internet is acetylfentanyl. So it is exactly fentanyl with an acetyl group on it. All that acetyl group does is help it get into the brain faster and help more of it get into the brain instead of being broken down by the liver.
Legal or sort of?
Well, since 1986, we've had the Analog Act, which basically says if it's close enough, you can bring a case and you can try to convince us. More recently, in 2012, we had the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act, which was spurred largely by the synthetic cathinones in the bath salts and the synthetic cannabinoids in the K2 spice products and some of the newer structures for hallucinogenic drugs, because chemically they're different enough that it's probably impossible to make the case that they're analogs of amphetamine for the cathinones or THC for the cannabinoids. So we just kind of defined some new structures as being things that we're going to blanketly schedule. And then in, I think, 2014, the Obama administration amended that yet again and gave a whole list of a bunch more drugs. So, you know, that acetylfentanyl, though, it turns out is much, much more potent than fentanyl. And all potency means, you know, so you hear it on TV all the time. They always talk about a potent new drug. Nobody cares how potent a drug is. Potency just means dose, right? So LSD, a tiny amount that will fit on the end of your finger, is sufficient for you to be intoxicated for most of a day. Ethanol, you need many, 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 many drinks. But that doesn't stop anybody from drinking. That's why the line at the bar is biggest at the bathroom, is people will just drink and pee until they get enough. So the potency of a drug really doesn't seem to correlate at all with its abuse liability, except for the fact that if you don't know what you're doing, you can very easily kill yourself if all of a sudden there's a much more potent analog, right? So a part of me wonders a lot about how much of these fentanyl overdoses are actually due to acetylfentanyl, because by the time we get there and take the blood, it may not be distinguishable as acetylfentanyl anymore. It may just look identical to fentanyl. So, you know, there's your acute toxicity, right? The first time you take one, it can be a more potent drug than you're used to, and you can kill yourself with the opioids by respiratory depression. You may have an undiagnosed heart problem that you could live probably your whole life with until you get to middle age and all of a sudden you have a heart attack and then the doctors figure it out. But now you're 20 and you smoke some meth and that puts enough stress on your heart that you have a heart attack now. So there's your acute toxicity. It's not so much that the drug did it, something would have done it eventually, but that's what turned it on. You may be somebody that has some susceptibility to schizophrenia or psychosis, which can be kicked into using some of these synthetic cannabinoids. There are these cases of people that smoke K2 spice the very first time they've ever had it, and they wind up psychotic for 3 or 4 weeks, and they're in an emergency room, and we don't know why. One issue, that's your acute toxicity. Most people can take drugs, get high, have a good time, and be fine the next day. Some people can't, and I can't tell you which is which, and probably neither can you. Especially when you are someone who is a first-time drug user, who is taking a drug that you might not even know what it is, right? So you go to the store and you buy bath salts. What's in it? Nobody knows. Could be methadone, could be one of the pyrovalerone compounds. It could just be a ton of caffeine, right? We don't know. Your acute toxicity is different. Your acute toxicity is what's going to gradually occur with repeated drug use over time. And, you know, there's all kinds of obvious examples of that. And some of it, you know, is certainly due to the drug. Some of it is just due to the lifestyle of constantly obtaining, using, and recovering from drugs. So, you know, when you think of a methamphetamine user, you think skinny, you think bad teeth, right? You think bad skin. And, you know, some of that is because the drug effect themselves leads to these tactile kind of hallucinations almost, where people feel like there's bugs on their skin and they pick. Some of the skinniness is just that instead of eating, they're getting drugs and using drugs, and one of the drug effects is hunger suppression. So you get skinny because you're just not eating as much. The stuff that you do eat tends to be poor quality food, and so your teeth rot. You know, you stop taking care of your personal hygiene. So, you know, is that a drug effect? Kind of. It's certainly, if you weren't using the drugs, you may be taking better care of yourself. You know, there are other examples of things like that as well, where sort of repeatedly using drugs can lead to sort of more extreme toxicities. And, you know, even marijuana and cannabis, there's been this association with prolonged cannabis use and schizophrenia and psychosis later in life. And I think people don't necessarily appreciate how strong that relationship actually is. We tend to think of marijuana as a fairly harmless drug. So,
well, we think of alcohol as harmless, but it's clearly...
Well, I think a lot of people don't, right? I mean, so the chronic alcoholism...
We treat it legally, like...
Oh yeah, of course we do. But, as far as chronic toxicity goes, alcohol is probably the best example you can give, right? You produce brain damage. You can produce Wernicke's encephalopathy and all kinds of stuff. You get cirrhosis of the liver. And, that stuff is all due to the alcohol. That's direct ethanol toxicity on the liver, on the brain. And so, that's a really good example. It's not going to happen with a couple of drinks, but it's going to happen when 80% of your caloric intake every day is from alcohol. So, I talk to the students about this all the time, is that, can you obtain a drug, even something that is considered a pretty hardcore drug, crack, heroin? Could you go and get that, use it once, have a good time, and never use it again? Yeah, absolutely you could, and most people do. I think of all the people that use drugs, maybe 10% of them become drug addicts, probably less. We don't know why. What's the difference between people that can sort of responsibly use drugs, even illegal, really powerful drugs, and continue to live a life, maintain a family, maintain a career, and those that can't? We don't know. It's a really big area of research right now. It's one of the things that the National Institutes of Health is most interested in. What are the individual differences that underlie this predisposition to uncontrolled drug use and addiction?